for our talk today here. She's particularly interested in survey-based research using microeconometric approaches to understand broader questions of agrarian change and state delivery systems for nutrition security. Her current research focuses on contract farming, technology adoption in agriculture, public policies for food security, employment, and agriculture nutrition linkages. So I welcome you, ma'am, for to enlighten all of us on these new laws that have created so much of discussion and protest across the country today.
Thank you very much.
So before we start, if we'd like to know your views on the topic we are discussing today. So there are a few questions I'll put across so that you can give us an elaborate detail on what you think about this. So do you think the three legislations which have been introduced recently and have created so much of protest across the country will benefit the corporate players more than they would the farmers?
So if you'll excuse me with this one, I'll give a fairly long answer so that one understands the history and the context better. So as many of us are aware, the Indian Constitution declares agriculture, markets, trade and fairs, the two things, to be state subjects. At the same time, the central government is in charge of free trade and commerce within the territory. So hitherto, I'm wondering if you can hear me well, because
it's a little low, but yes, we can hear you.
Okay, let me just raise my voice a little more. So far, the way in which agriculture markets were functioning, it was largely the jurisdiction of the state governments. And in the 1960s, the need was felt to have a set of agricultural produce marketing committees that would actually give oversight to primary transactions. Primary transactions refers to the first transaction between farmer and buyer. So there are secondary transactions, and that can go from buyer to another buyer. The primary is where the farmer sells. So because at the time of independence, many farmers were selling to moneylenders, local traders, and were at their mercy, and it was largely diffused and bilateral. The government felt that let's bring people to one place where there are many buyers, many sellers, and that becomes a space where there's competition, and there can also be oversight to ensure that farmers are not exploited. So historically, the state governments actually had, through their APMC acts in the 60s, were regulating trade. Now, ever since 1991, there's been a gradual relaxation of the jurisdiction of APMCs. It used to be mandated, but many states have reformed their laws to say that private players can set up market yards. Many states already allowed contract farming. Many solvent extractors, in fact, have their own procurement centers. And many states have done substantially well to reform the laws to allow space for private players. And that became necessary because, as you all know, in 1991, we liberalized and deregulated. So the expansion of private players meant that the laws had to adapt. Now, what the government, so it's not as if this, the laws that the three farm laws that have been passed are dramatic in taking us in a new direction. It just does it, the way in which it was done was dramatic, but what it does is not actually, it's in continuation of what has already been happening. So we often say that what is the stream now becomes a gushing river, because already private players are active, but these acts actually open the floodgates. Now, with that in mind, I think there are reservations about the way it was done, and the justification that the government gives us, this reform is taking too much time and building state consensus is very hard. So we are now going to do it like a big bang approach and somewhat less federalist approach to doing this. Now to the question on whether it will help the farmers or the corporate players, I think an important part of all three acts is that even though it has the name of the farmer in every other line, Actually, the premise is not that there's nothing that about these acts that directly affect the farmers, or it's not focused on the farmer. What it does is it's trying to build an ecosystem around the farmers. So it's trying to change the context in which farmers operate. And that is actually directed towards other supply chain actors. So the premise is that there are a lot of inefficiencies in the system. The APMC are not functioning particularly well, and in many places there is collusion. And the way to get rid of this problem is actually to bring in more competition. So this is a very private sector buyer oriented law, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We want more competition so that farmers have greater choice. But what it essentially says is once the supply chain actors come and they make efficiency gains and investments, they'll share the gains with the farmer. And so it does two things. One is now, because there is anything that's now outside the mandi is called a trade area. And until now, states could levy a mandi charge for all transaction in the relevant area. Now they can't. So one is the taxation on first transactions reduces, and the new players don't have to buy licenses which were required before. So the entry barriers are lower now, and the cost of transacting are lower. The question now is whether they will transfer these benefits to the farmers, and that's not very clear. So while the farm laws are very highly likely to benefit, I would say, buyers, I don't want to use the word corporate players, because corporate players themselves are very heterogeneous. And you also have farmers cooperatives and farmer producers organizations. So in some ways they are buying from farmers. So it's a very heterogeneous group. So rather than calling them corporate players, I would just like to say supply chain actors or buyers. It substantially lowers the entry barriers and transactions cost. Now the question is, will they transfer the benefits to the farmer? And that's less clear. I anticipate that there are geographies where farmers will benefit greatly. Now, I notice that so many of you are located in Maharashtra and a couple of you are in Pune. If you look at the area around Pune, Narayangaon, and all of that, these are near demand centers. Likewise, around Bangalore, where anything grows, there is a huge demand center that just attracts a lot of fresh produce in particular. Now, many of the corporate players are concentrated there. As you move away, once you go to Vidarbha, you won't find that many corporate players or buyers or actors in the supply chain. So what you're going to have is a strengthening of the same kind of distribution, where supply chain actors are going to gravitate towards where they already operate. There, the farmers will be strengthened because now they have choices, and many small players may be coming in. New ag tech firms may be coming in, so they may stand to benefit. I'm less optimistic about whether farmers in already remote areas with locational disadvantages, where costs of operating are very high, they may not be attracting private players at all, and it's unlikely these acts are going to change that dramatically for them. Uh, so this is in the short term. In the long term, it's very difficult to say what happens. Now, we are riding on savings of costs and competition to strengthen the farmers' relative bargaining power and the prices they get. But we don't know whether the industry will consolidate. And our evidence from globally, in the global experience in the sector suggests that many supply chain actors rapidly consolidate. So you may start with many buyers, but eventually they come to an understanding, they take over each other. So there is efficiency in consolidation for supply chain actors, and which makes sense. If you're a business, you want to consolidate, get scale, and gain from that. So because your margins are fairly thin, you want scale to be able to be profitable. If that happens, whether the farmer will be left to fend for themselves, or whether they'll come up with the being shortchanged, I think that's a worry that farmers do have. So I'll stop there, and so we can open up other questions. I can't hear you, Swan.
So my question here is, in that case, do you think In a highly unpredictable and nature-dependent activity like farming, it makes sense to have written contracts with profit-oriented business houses.
Yeah, I think this question is in two parts. In general, in India, I've seen many very ethical, responsible agri-businesses that have interacted with farmers in a way that the risks are actually shared and there's a deeper understanding and links. So if you look at a lot of the old large enterprises, I think of Paris Agro in the south, ITC, and many of them have very deep, and Paris is not just the only one, Shakti Sugars in Coimbatore, and many of them have a very strong record of having fairly equitable relationships with farmers where the risks are shared, and the risks are shared in the following sense. But normally, internationally, when you contract with a farmer, it's to it's a promise.
Ms. Sudha, you're muted. Yeah.
Her. Or she can unmute herself.
Yeah, I just did. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
somebody else had muted me.
Yeah.
So I was saying that many agri-businesses do share risks with farmers. If you look at the context of India, many contracts between agri-businesses and farmers works in a way where the farmers are told that whatever you grow in this 1 acre, I promise to buy it. Now that means if the farmer faces a yield risk, that risk is actually passed on partly to the firm because the firm hasn't contracted for quantities. It's contracted for acreage. So in that sense, the farmer's protected a little bit and exposed, but it's not as if they're compelled to sell so much. So that's the first part. There are good examples of risk sharing. And very often, many of agribusinesses also give inputs, give technical advice. In my own PhD, I studied a cotton contract farming scheme, and I asked the farmers said the cotton contracts did not work. I said, then why are you continuing to contract? They said, actually, the extension agent comes and he also gives us advice for other crops. So there is a sense in which they benefit. However, I have to emphasize that for every good agribusiness you see, you also see two that act very irresponsibly. So and there I don't think the dispute resolution mechanisms are available to the farmers. And as people who have grievances with normal commerce, even buying online, we can imagine what the farmers' situation is. But the one common thread across all good and bad enterprises is, in general, firms and agribusinesses prefer not to have written contracts because they need the flexibility to actually move a little bit plus or minus from contract terms. Contract terms tie people in very narrowly. Now, some people like PepsiCo, all of them, they write contracts. But in my experience, I've noticed that when firms write contracts, it's more to protect themselves rather than really clarify the terms of the contract, because you don't want to somebody accusing you and taking you to court, especially because of India. We have a lot of active civil society actors who watch out for the farmers. So I think that fear makes them write contracts. And farmers also don't want contracts because they don't entirely understand what it implies. In fact, in the early days of contract farming in Orissa, many people lost their land because they'd actually signed off their land and they'd given land as collateral for default. So because of that, I think there's a general reluctance to write written contracts, which raises the question of whether we needed a Contract Farming Act in the first place, rather than allowing contracting to happen the way it has been happening so far, which is based on trust, mutual understanding, and a deeper relationship.
So that actually brings me to the other question I had. That you mentioned in your article that the three bills collectively invisibilize trade area transactions, contract farming, and stocking in a way that makes them unregulatable. Can you explain how and why?
Yeah, so this it helps for us to understand the way things happen now. Today, because the APMCs have jurisdiction over markets, there is reporting of transactions. We know how much has arrived. what prices it's traded. And anybody here who's in the audience here, you can just Google agmarket.nic.in, and you will find that across all mandis in India, how much of which commodity arrived, the minimum price, the maximum price, and the modal price that was transacted. Now, that degree of transparency is useful because it also helps you enforce or enable contestable markets or competitive markets. So if you look at the onion story, the Competition Commission of India recently did a research using these data to detect collusion among onion traders in Lasalgaon in Maharashtra. Now, this kind of thing is possible because there is data and because there is transparency. Now, the three acts that we have a big problem. They mention transparency quite a bit, actually. But on the other hand, by saying that outside mandi trade is now allowed freely, e-platforms are allowed freely, and there's no registration, no reporting requirement. And all of this means that as this sector grows and many private players come in, many of them are going to be experimenting. You don't know what is going on in that large part of the market. And presuming that it grows and it becomes more important in APMC, you're going to have no information at all. So even though you're saying these bills are going to promote competition, you can't even assess whether it has promoted competition. That's one part. So it becomes unregulatable. The second part of the story is, supposing you want to decide to ban onion exports. I'm using onion as an example because we are reading it regularly in the newspaper these days. You want to ban onion exports because the prices for consumers have become too high. How do you decide when to ban? You need to have a reliable, credible information on prices from across the country. Now, do we know what contract farming prices are? We don't know. And that's going to be the situation, that for trade policy and for food policy initiatives and procurement, you're going to have less information. I mean, you will have information from the mandis, but if the mandis are not reflective of what is actually going on and it's not important anymore, then the question is, what data do we use to even make sensible decisions? So that's what I meant by saying it invisibilizes transactions and makes them unregulatable. And likewise with the Essential Commodities Act. The third act says unlimited hoarding. But today, if I have a go down or a warehouse and I don't register it in the Warehouse Development Regulatory Authority, then I never have to report how much I'm hoarding. So on the one hand, you're giving freedom, but that freedom comes without responsibility, which in turn hurts the government in its ability to make decisions and ensure competition.
So does that also mean that, I mean, in your opinion, how does this, there's a lack of regulation and regulatory oversight and the weak dispute resolution mechanism affect the farmers or put them in a disadvantageous situation?
Yeah, I think the truth about agriculture transactions, and I think that's something that most of us agree on, is that it's impossible to regulate every single transaction because, I mean, look at the volumes that are being traded and the number of farmers who are there. Of course, in India, we don't know how many farmers there are, but assuming we do, there are too many of them and too many transactions to regulate. We don't even want that kind of regulation, because then all you'll have is Inspector Raj, and it will lead to corruption, forms of corruption of its own. So we don't want regulation everywhere, but at the same time, to have no regulation is quite dangerous. And in the piece that I wrote for the India Forum, I cite that the experience of deregulation in dairy that happened in 91. Until then, it was reserved for the cooperative sector, and when they removed it, all kinds of private players came, milk was adulterated, it was chaotic. And so within a year, they had to bring back the milk and milk products order. So deregulation complete without any safeguards or oversight is a problem. I mean, we need to have a realistic sense of when farmers can actually access these dispute resolution mechanisms to settle disputes. But our current history suggests that where farmers are empowered and where civil society also engages directly with the farmers, where they're politically organized, they have actually used the APMC to resolve a lot of disputes. That we are hearing from many farmers organizations. Likewise, taking contract farming agribusinesses to court for alleged wrongdoing is also, we have examples of that as well. So I think I would have liked to see more easily accessible dispute resolution mechanism that protects or gives farmers a platform for grievance redressal and dispute resolution.
Thank you, ma'am. I think a few questions that are coming in. Mr. Ajay, would you like to ask your question, or shall I ask it to you?
It's better that you ask.
Okay.
What he has already written.
Yeah. So he's asked, so do you also anticipate that once corporates take control on supply chain, they might command the price or pay to the farmer for the produce?
I think that's usually what happens. Much as I'm not somebody who's anti-corporate or anti-business, but the logic of business, and that's understandable, is that they want to cut back on costs. Now, of all the costs that you can actually economize on, the farmer is somewhat, it's more malleable. You can actually push back the prices. Now, there are limits to this, right? So if you ask people who have deeper relationships with farmers, and that's why I keep talking about the benign players, they see that they are engaging with the farmers on a longer term relationship. And they also understand that if you cut prices too much, then the farmers are just going to back off as long as they have an alternative. So the alternative is key. If you don't have alternatives, then you can really push them to the least price they can get. And we do see instances of that happening. And this is globally, it's been documented that businesses to get, it's a bit like consumers and retail, right? You're given discounts to get on board, and then once you're there, the competition falls off, and then the price increases. You have the mirror image in from the farmer and buyer relationship, and it's often called agribusiness normalization, where agribusinesses give something and then they normalize and push farmers on the back foot. So it is known to happen, but there are cases where it doesn't happen. And I think that's where the idea of, are we able to maintain a system which is competitive? And there the bills again are completely quiet on this.
So one more question from Sudhirji. Sudhirji, would you like to ask a question? Or?
Maya, I think you please ask all the questions.
Okay, I'll do. So Sudhirji wants to know, can we know your expert opinion on the viability of Amul-like cooperative farmers, which could sell directly to consumers through its own shops across India?
Yeah, I think I'm actually grateful for this question, because I think there is the views are very divided. Personally, I'm all for cooperatives, and I don't necessarily mean one kind of cooperative. Cooperatives themselves can be organized very differently. I'm of the view that today it's very hard for farmers to make a living relying only on agriculture. And given the size of the land holdings, the margins are thin, and you only if you scale up and have large firms can you make the money to have a decent income. That's not possible, because for many people, they have very small land holdings. Then what's the way out? They have to capture a higher and higher share of the value chain. And the only way you can do it is to either get involved in processing itself, or try and capture more of the retail market, so that you are capturing a higher value in the entire chain. And we have good examples. Amul is a good example, but it also had a lot of advantages in setting itself up. So we have, of course, we had the visionary leadership of Kurian at the helm, but also we were also protected. So imports were forbidden. And so it was like an infant industry argument that the cooperatives were nurtured under a protected environment. Now today, it's a different scenario. So for horticulture and all of that, it's much harder to do. And I want to give the example of Hopcoms in Karnataka, which actually did very well. It did exactly this, that it procured through an indent system from small farmers and sold it through their own network of very low cost supply chain. Actually, it's a very good example to study. Likewise, Safal and Mother Dairy. Unfortunately, we have a problem that unlike Amul, where we had leadership of the business being somewhat dissociated from political interference, we found that with the newer examples, that's not been entirely possible. The Araconite Cooperative in Shimoga is also a good example. It's not directly to the consumers via outlets, but the Araconite, actually, they have a lot of storage space. And if you go to Shimoga, you really understand the value of marketing cooperatives. And it has a long history, very strong foundations. Of course, there is there's politicization, but not all politicization is bad, and these are good examples. And I think somewhere we've begun to dismiss cooperatives as an old idea. The farmer producers companies have come up in a big way, both for FPOs, farmer producer organizations, and farmer producer companies, which are actually registered as companies. And there, many FPOs actually say we are the new cooperative movement. So I think there is a lot to be excited about in terms of what the FPOs can do, not just as a dominant form of institution in Indian agriculture, but also because they can also leverage the benefits of the three bills in ways that are quite unique, where I see farmers actually benefiting from these laws. But there the ecosystem that FPOs needs a lot of investment. And unfortunately, the current government, I think the intention is right. The 10,000 FPOs is a goal, but it almost reads as if it was written by a management consultant. I hope there are no management consultants here, but very often I find that they are very ambitious in the goals. But in fact, an FPO group told me how many accountants you would need to support the 10,000 FPOs to even understand what the accounting laws are. And I think the thinking through of the whole ecosystem that's need to set up 10,000 FPOs is sort of deemed unrealistic. And I think that's an area that anybody should actually now push for. How do you get this right? Because to me, this is going to really make or break or shape Indian agriculture into the future. But I'm all for that kind, where farmers get a higher and higher share of the supply chain, and we know no better model. I don't think we've worked hard enough to make cooperatives and FPOs successful, and I think that's where our effort should be.
Maya, if there is time, I would like to ask a related question to this.
Yeah, please.
I agree to your view, Sudhaji, completely. And actually, what I meant by cooperative was more in the sense of the spirit of cooperative, the working of cooperative, than the name cooperative. So, for example, what I presume, if thousands of farmers, let's say per state, come together, or even per district come together, and they have their produce as a one unit, and then they together have the storage facility and the processing facility, which of course would need and should get the financial support of government, which can actually invest in it for return. They need not give as a grant, I think, because farmers have enough. The amount of money that the exporters and the importers earn out of farm is more than enough value that they have. So if all that power is vested into the farmers itself and a group of farmers, and right up to the complete supply chain and the sale, if everything benefits farmers, then I think the whole thing can be transformed very well.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I think a good example, we have the Sahyadri Producers Organization in Maharashtra, based out of Nasik, that's seen as an example of this. And there's no doubt that when we mean cooperative, it's really about the spirit of getting together, collectively marketing and setting up these facilities. So the Sahyadri, actually, they depended on loans commercial loans from banks, and they did take advantage of a few government schemes. But there's another very interesting example called Malabar Meat, where it's quite an interesting example to study, where actually they ensured that farmers, the meat producers themselves actually contributed money to setting up the processing plant, and they built their own brand name. And I think there you have extremes where even without government support, there's a lot you can do. I'm somebody who feels that the state should support, partly because not all farmers are alike. Farmers in Nashik and Kerala might have the wherewithal to set up things and have the market intelligence, recruit the right people to go forward. In many areas, they may not have that. So where the need is there, I think state support is definitely something that we should look at. Yeah, whether the state gets returns out of it or not, I think I need to think a little more about it, because I feel, why not grants? Because at the end of the day, there are grants given to so many other purposes which are not half as important. So whether it's state, commercial enterprise, or self-financed, I think we have a range of models, all of which are possible to explore. And I believe that pluralist approach to diversity of institutions is important. I do want to, however, point out that I've talked to a lot of FPOs where they say that even if there's cooperative spirit, the nature of the commodity ends up mattering a lot. So if you have jasmine, for example, I spoke to an FPO from AP. They were saying that the jasmine quality is so different by different farmers that when they come and try to aggregate the produce, actually what is a nice cohesive group, they start arguing because the quality differences are very large. So the person who's coming with a high quality, their average price reduces. So I think there are challenges based on which product you're dealing with. And I think Sahyadri Producers Organization, I don't want to be quoted on that because this is just based on one visit and a conversation. They actually send out labor, give advisories, give technical advice, so that they have actually control over quality of produce. So then you're entering the production system. So you want not collectivization of just marketing, but also some collective farming in some sense, so that your standards are also homogenized across people within the group. I hope that that's adequate in terms of engaging with your view.
Very true. I think our views are very close to each other. I thank you very much for this, because just one line, the difference between the farmer's selling price today and the consumer's buying price is so big that if the whole thing gets into the control of farmers or for the interest of farmer, the problem will be solved. Thanks a lot for, clarifying so many things. Thank you.
Even I had a question related to this, but before that, I would like to ask a few questions that some of the audience have asked. Mr. Mehru has asked, what percentage of farmers are gentlemen farmers like Amitabh Bachchan, and what percentage of the market do they have?
I have to say upfront that I don't know the answer, but happily I'm in good company because I don't think the government of India knows either. So one of the problems is that we haven't defined who a farmer is. The National Commission of Farmers, that was headed by Professor M.S. Swaminathan, they had a very, very broad definition of farmers, which includes all agricultural workers, whether or not you had land. However, in most government schemes of the government of India or many state governments like the Raitu Bandhu scheme of Telangana, they actually treat farmers as equivalent to somebody owning agricultural land. Now, when you do that, then you end up counting gentlemen farmers as farmers because they have agricultural land. Now, if you define farmers by what they actually do, then you would exclude gentlemen farmers and include tenant farmers, women farmers who often don't have title to land but do all the work, especially where male out-migration is very high. So the truth is, I don't have a number. What percentage of the market do they have? The percentage of gentlemen farmers who are actually doing agriculture is likely to be very, very, very small. However, absentee farmers whose tenants are producing, that's likely to be very high. And typically tenancy by law is banned in many states. So when you go and do a survey and you ask whether you're a tenant, there is a reluctance to respond because legally they are not supposed to have tenancy relations. But it is known to be upward of 75% in districts like West Godavari, where there's been a lot of outmigration to the cities. And we are seeing very vibrant land markets for tenancy, but these are all hidden and we don't have very reliable official numbers. But so gentlemen farmers, probably very minuscule, but absentee farmers whose tenants are producing would be very high. I'm sorry, I don't have a more precise answer.
No, so does the new farm laws actually impact this tenancy or how the land holdings are maintained?
No, I don't think so. One thing, the contract farming law actually says that land leasing will not be considered contract. So there was a danger that many large businesses, they don't want to work with a large number of small farmers because it's costly for them to do so. They'd rather assemble and consolidate land and have factory production, factory style. Now they want to safeguard against that. So the contract farming law actually says that you can't do land leasing and then claim it's contract farming. But at the same time, it's not clear enough. So many people who are farmers organizations, they worry that this can be misused by people who just want to lease land. So the farmers become workers on their own land. Okay, so that is there. Now, to answer your question on what implication it has on tenancy, my own feeling, and this is coming from reading government policy trajectory over the years, is that the next step is going to be land leasing laws. We have already seen Karnataka has relaxed the laws to say non-agriculturalists can also buy land. Then there's a land ceiling and tenancy. So I think in terms of where we are headed, I would expect these laws also to follow, giving more and more room for corporate players to enter and begin engaging in farming themselves.
So the next two questions are based on the MSP. So I'll just club them together. Is MSP a legal right to farmers in India? Since the choice of going to Mandi or outside remains with the farmers, how would they get influenced? The other question is, Punjab and Chhattisgarh have linked MSP to APMC and trade area transactions. Will it work and in which direction?
So the MSP is not a legal right to farmers, and I think there is some consensus on the legality of MSP, but it is a kind of a moral commitment. Now, how has that worked so far? The MSP, as many of you might have read recently, is restricted, even though they announce it for over 23 crops. In terms of actual implementation, it's fairly restricted. So FCI buys mainly rice and wheat, and many state civil supplies corporations buy that. Cotton has CCI buys cotton often, and NAFED actually does oil seeds and pulses procurement, occasionally coarse cereals as well. So one is it's restricted to certain commodities and in certain geographies. So this has been an issue that MSP is not a legal right, but it's not even a sharp instrument in the sense that supposing I'm in Bihar and my prices have fallen, I have no hope as a farmer that the government will come and procure something. Whereas in states where decentralized procurement has been implemented, I have a very real chance that the commodity I'm producing, I will get the MSP for it because there's a very streamlined, reliable, credible system of procurement. Now, the current acts actually say that things will go on unchanged as usual. So in some sense, the current laws do not say that the MSP will be removed, but I think there is a long shadow of questions around MSP. So the Shantakumar committee report that was released 5 years ago actually said that we should get rid of MSPs, go to a cash transfer system, FCI should be dismantled and repurposed. So I think there's a fear that this APMC bypassing is actually the first step to actually eventually dismantling the MSP. Now, it's a bit complicated and I don't want to go into too many details here, but supposing in the mandi, Punjab, the state government charges some cess for transacting in the mandi. Whenever public procurement happens at MSP in that mandi, a tax has to be paid to the state government. So it's in some sense a devolution of resources from the center to the state via these mandi taxes. Now, supposing you say APMC, you can bypass it, there are questions that the FCI's director will now face or chairman will face on whether or not to have procurement in the mandis or outside the mandis. Because we know that the CAG can always come back and say that you could have saved the tax by procuring outside. Why did you procure inside? So it's a very legal and tricky dilemma for people who are now engaged in the procurement system on where to procure. And so in some sense, the state governments are now trying to assure farmers that we'll continue procurement as before and the state will collect taxes. But whether or not it will be challenged by the CAG or something, it's a fairly tricky question. And I must say that whatever I've gleaned from this is actually from former bureaucrats who I think track these issues quite closely. I don't. And frankly, my eyes just glaze when it comes to CAG and accounting and these legal issues. But I think there are serious legal issues that many people are trying to grapple with. So I think it is the MSP itself, I think a lot rests on the state government's ability to continue procurement. I would add to Chhattisgarh, MP's wheat procurement has been stellar. Odisha's decentralized procurement has been exceedingly good. And these are all states that we need to watch to see how they adapt to this new system. I think it's too important an issue for them to let go. And my sense is you're going to see battles around this going forward. My sense is also that the government of India is kind of on the back foot. I don't think they anticipated such a backlash. And I think they will show their commitment to maintaining the MSP, at least going into the future. It raises larger question on what will happen after that. And I think it's too early for us to speculate. So we should just see how things go the next few years.
That brings me to one more of my questions.
Sorry, Mayaji. The question about Punjab and Chhattisgarh making it compulsory to transact at APMC, at the MSP, that has to be also taken up.
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed that one. Personally, I'm of the view that this is not a step in the right direction. Politically, I think the states are completely justified doing this. But I think in terms of whether they're able to enforce it, regulate it, and whether in the long run this is actually a viable approach or solution, I'm not in favor of that. In fact, I was thinking, how can farmers register protests better? And the example that came to my mind is actually the Andhra farmers who went on crop holiday and said they wouldn't grow crops one season. And if Punjab or Chhattisgarh were to do that today, I think it will bring the government of India on its knees. So in some sense, I'm not advocating that they do this, but I'm trying to see in the federal system, how is the voice of states heard when there is no formal process by which they can share their views. So I feel it's not a step that's going to benefit the states themselves in the longer run. But at this point, what choice they had to persuade the farmers that they are batting for them, and I don't think they had many options. So I leave it at that.
So what I wanted to ask you also was related to this, that now that the farm laws and agriculture, I mean, in your opinion, do you think the farm laws and agriculture market should be governed and regulated by the state or by the center? And at present, is there a conflict of interest here?
Okay, so in some sense, what I feel, I suppose, is less relevant than what the Constitution says. And the Constitution says trade within the states will belong to the state government, and overarching regulation is by the center. now wasn't much conflict of interest, right? So as I mentioned, states were already reforming APMCs, but the center had its hands tied because it can only persuade states to adopt some things. So in that sense, I don't see it as a conflict, but I just see as the kind of a gradualism that you can't go do things at a fast pace because of the state center differences in the way they do things, and different states do things at different paces. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing, because going very slowly allows for course correction. It allows losers in the system. So every reform has winners and losers. The losers get time to adapt to a new system. So I'm in favor of gradualism, even if there is a bit of conflict, because these are inbuilt checks and balances that ensure that we don't make big mistakes in the wrong direction, or rather big mistakes suddenly overnight. So I don't think that's the case. To answer what do I feel is the optimal? I feel that many of the best ideas in India in terms of innovative solutions have come from the state government. And I think we lose that by putting too much regulatory power to the center. And states understand their agriculture way better. And as we know, there's no one size fits all in India. Even within a state, the geographies are different, socio-demographics are different. And I think states are best placed to regulate their markets and ascertain their farmers' needs. At the same time, we are one country, and there is a space for a kind of a national market. So if you look at something like a stock exchange, why is a stock exchange managed at the center and not by the states? Because there's something national about it. Now, my own vision would be that it would have been great if the center had built a national commodity exchange of that could have been the kind of a template of which all of these electronic platforms and different states work off. So the states have their own physical products and their regulation, but the center has controls a national commodity exchange through which they can influence policy overall. For me, that would have been a nice way to have both states and center play their role, while at the same time ensuring that we are doing things gradually, step by step. Yeah, benefits come slowly and it's frustrating, but we have scope for course correction. So I would have liked to see something like that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sudha. Now, I think since we are close to the end of our session, I would like to invite anybody, if they have any questions, to please come up and ask. I think I've covered all the questions that were asked on the chat. We can take a minute or two before we close the session.
Sudhaji, in Bihar, what we have seen is that the private markets have not been developed. And as a result, 90% of the trade takes place in the villages. And as a result, what is happening is that the area under cultivation for pulses and edible oil seeds is steadily declining. And it is only wheat, maize, and sugarcane where the production is going up. So if this were to happen in the rest of the country, it would mean a big setback for food security. Don't you think so?
I think I'll answer this question by actually using two other states as examples. So if you, there are two lessons I think we can learn from Bihar. One is that allowing bypass of APMC mandis is not a sufficient condition. Just because you remove these restrictions of APMC doesn't mean that private trade is going to flourish. Because it links back to the first point that I made. Private businesses don't want to go everywhere. And if you ask a private business, would you rather work in Maharashtra or Bihar? I'm sure 9 out of 10 players, no matter what crop they are dealing with, will choose Maharashtra because of governance, infrastructure, law, and all of that. So in some sense, which also says why the state's role is very relevant today, because you have to give a support system for private enterprise to also go in. And Bihar's case is a very good example of where you've allowed complete free trade, but nobody has come because there is something else that's preventing them, either costs or the economies or because it's landlocked and urban centers are all too far away. Even moving produce is going to be very expensive. I think so. The Bihar is actually always a very good lesson for why private businesses won't go everywhere. But at the same time, I don't worry that the same thing will happen in other states for the reasons I shared. So if Karnataka were to dismantle APMC, I think they would have less to worry about because private trade will come in and there may be competition because there are huge demand centers. So I don't think this is going to be a source of great worry in terms of food security. Having said that, I said I would highlight two other cases. The two other states that don't have an APMC Act are Kerala and Mizoram, and they have very dramatic differences from Bihar. Kerala plantation crops, I know there's somebody from Kerala here, and so you have a very different kind of agriculture there. Now the state there has announced minimum support prices for horticulture. So here is complete free market in that sense. You have plantation agriculture, high commercial expert orientation, but also you have a state-supported MSP now that's coming in, and it's a food scarce state. So in some sense, we have a national compact with Kerala farmers, which is implicit, say that you export, get export earnings, and we'll take care of your food security, right? In fact, the Punjab farmers surplus is what is also helping implicitly Kerala be self-sufficient. I'm kind of oversimplifying it, but it's to say that they've specialized without APMC markets in a completely different set of commodities in contrast to Bihar. If you go to Mizoram, there the market access is so hard. So where they are saying, please have an APMC regulation because we want an APMC Act because only then will we build markets. Otherwise, we don't have a market to sell. So you have a anti-Bihar in the sense that they are already selling like Bihar farmers in their own village, but they desperately want a mandi. So you have, without APMC, it shows how context is everything and how private players are not going to go everywhere. They're not doing social service. They're not here to help the farmers. And we have to understand that limits. And it's a nice way to conclude because I think these farm bills just presume it's in some ways it's sort of absolving the state of its responsibility and its role and saying we've failed in public extension, marketing, now private players will come and do everything. And I think it's unfair at one level to the private players to take on the burden of farmer welfare, right? I mean, they can do only that much, they will do only that much. And farm bills actually do not give us that part about what is the state going to do for the farmers. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I mean, you have given us a lot of clarity on the issue. But again, it leads us to this question as to what changes in the current, the new laws would actually make it more beneficial for both the farmers, consumers, and the private players. So with that, I think we will conclude the session for now. And hopefully we can meet again for more further discussion in the near future.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the very knowledgeable session. It helps to learn many things. Thank you, Sudhaji. Thank you, Humanist Party, for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you all, and peace, force, and joy to all of you.
Thank you very much for an excellent session. Very, very clear.
Yeah,
thank you.